Hello, and welcome to the WildBlue podcast, perspectives on aviation lives, lifestyles, and business.
Hi, this is Chris Kirk at WildBlue Aircraft Sales, and welcome to the WildBlue podcast, where we discuss perspectives on aviation, lifestyles, and business. And today we're talking with Mac Swindell, and Mac is one of our sales advisors here at WildBlue. So welcome, Mac, and thanks for agreeing to do this.
You bet. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. So if you would just start off giving everybody a little bit of your background and your history, who you are.
Well, I live in Oklahoma and grew up here, and it's kind of funny professionally, I guess. My career sort of taken a full circle. I started out in aviation, went to Oklahoma State, got my license, private certificate there while I was a student, and then went to work for Boeing in Wichita, which is now Spirit. But as an engineer, transferred back to Oklahoma City with Boeing, still kind of moved over to the defense side. So started out right after school in the aviation, aerospace. Went to Gulfstream after that. We had a factory. Gulfstream had a facility, an assembly facility on the south end of Wiley Post Airport down in Bethany.
Right.
And then had an opportunity to join a new venture early in 2000. Was in February of 2000. It was a brand new company involved in telemedicine. And if you think about where we were in 2000 in telemedicine, there was a lot of work to do. Broadband was not available. We really got involved in a lot of details technically to connect remote sites with medical specialists at a distant location and create a network that was reliable and consistent and delivered a good product. So that kind of took me over into healthcare for, I guess it was probably 12 or 13 years, and had a chance to actually start a company with some radiologists, but we really set up a teleradiology group, kind of a virtual practice, so to speak, with a group of radiologists that were primarily in the national capital area. These were military radiologists that had the opportunity to provide this service to rural hospitals primarily, but also some larger community hospitals and even some metropolitan hospitals after hours, leveraging our technology. We based the company in DC. I stayed in Oklahoma. It was really pretty cool. We had, I think we had 5 or 6 probably at the height of that startup. We had 5 or 6 radiologists that were all in the Army in Hawaii. There was a 6-hour time difference that we were able to leverage between the East Coast and Hawaii. So it worked out really, really well and was a lot of fun. And in the course of all that, when I started in the healthcare sector, the company I went to work for was a startup, had a couple of airplanes, and I was a pilot, had gotten my license at Oklahoma State, like I said, and had added an instrument rating somewhere in the course of living life, and had a couple of airplanes that were company cars. So, we traveled over a 5-state area. There were 3 of us in the company, all pilots, and traveled over a 5-state area with our airplanes that were based at Wiley Post. And that's really when I really started to appreciate and develop at least the lifestyle, the comfort level, the MO of using an airplane to really expand our reach, and it became a daily thing.
Yes. Did you have, remind me, because I don't remember, did you have your license before you went to Oklahoma State?
I got it at Oklahoma State. So it was my senior year. I grew up in northeastern Oklahoma. It's a small town. Cushing is where I grew up, and I was a kid in the 70s. And if you're familiar with general aviation, you know that the peak general aviation manufacturing year was 1979. So 70s were a great time for piston-powered airplanes, and I had a lot of friends, families that had airplanes, and flew around with a lot of them as a kid growing up, and it's something I always wanted to do. So when I got to Oklahoma State, they had a real active program. The Flying Aggies were there, great student organization, and took ground school as a 3-hour course, and my practical flight instruction I took as a course as well, which was I think a 2 or 3 hour course. I did that my senior year that I was there.
So, but you didn't have anybody really in your family that kind of sparked the desire to learn how to fly?
It was just friends, dads, really, we'd $100 hamburger trips, on Tuesday night, things like that. I remember flying over when I probably was 4th or 5th grade, a guy that worked with my mom at a refinery that was there in Cushing, had a little 150 and just gotten his license, and took me along for a ride along over to Stillwater to pick up some charts, that kind of stuff. That's really where it came from.
Yeah. Yeah, if I remember right, Cushing is when I fly over, it's the place that's got all the oil tanks. They're out there.
That's correct, right? It's hard to miss.
Just right there along I-44.
It's just north of I-44, just southeast of Stillwater. It's got all those storage tanks and skydivers on the weekends.
Yeah, that's right. I remember seeing that on the sectional. So, and one thing interesting here for folks to know is that Mac is in. You're actually just outside of Edmond, close to Sundance Airport in Piedmont, right?
Right.
And so the rest of us are here in Kansas City. So he does operate a little bit remotely. And the Zoom thing or Google Meet, whatever we use, isn't really anything new for us. We've been doing it for quite a while. But Todd and Tabby and I are here in Kansas City, Mac's down there. But we still get to see each other fairly frequently. In fact, Mac and I were just talking before we started recording here that we'll probably see each other next week when I take my plane down to Enid to be worked on. And Mac does some flying out of Enid. And so maybe we could segue right into that from, what the tie-in is with Enid.
Sure. I do fly a Pilatus that's in Enid that there's, I guess, 5 or 6 companies that are involved in that airplane. And all of those companies that are domiciled right here in Oklahoma, based right in Enid, family-owned businesses for the most part, recognized many years ago. Matter of fact, one of them is an insurance company there in Enid. They've had a Bonanza or a Baron in the family, in the business since 1947. They actually had a Beech Model 17 Stagger Wing prior to that the owner of the company, which was the grandfather of the brothers that run the company now, he was flying back from a meeting in northwestern Oklahoma, and the airplane caught on fire. And he successfully landed it, got out of it, but his first call was to Walter Beech, asking about a metal airplane because that airplane was burning up around him as he was making that emergency landing. And that was in 1947 when the Bonanza was brand new. He bought one. It's really, really a pretty cool story, and they've had a number of them since then. So I fly their Bonanza from time to time, and then a Pilatus that they're involved in as well. And, that I think where I was going with that is they have learned that being based in Enid, general aviation is a real asset to them because they really can extend their reach. And even some of those folks travel internationally, and we use the Pilatus as sort of that connection for them to make it very workable to connect with an international flight, typically at DFW.
Yeah. So you've got some very good practical experience and history on how a general aviation airplane, whether it's been your own or through folks who are flying piston airplanes or now who are flying turboprop airplanes, and how they can really impact really their bottom line, I guess, at the end of the day. And that's what they're probably looking for, isn't it?
It is. And, living where I live in Oklahoma, I feel very blessed. We live in a great part of the country where the weather is very accommodating pretty much year-round. There's very few days that we feel like we can't go for one reason or another. But and I learned that when we were working, when I was based there at Wiley Post with the telemedicine startup. We had a turbocharged 310 R model that we could take. We also had a MAL, and I was in a flying club that had all Cessna fleet. So it's, nothing terribly exotic. It's single engine airplanes, but we were able to extend our reach with three guys. We had clients that were just a few hours away, if need be able to respond to make a hot shot kind of run, into Arkansas. I remember one of the coolest stories, really experiences, was we had some equipment that was in El Paso that was failing. We received a call at probably 10 o'clock in the morning. We're coming up on a 4th of July holiday weekend, and it was mission critical that this stuff be up and running over that holiday weekend, and wasn't any big thing to scramble right then and there at that moment. I think I went to Subway and grabbed a sandwich and had some other guys get the airplane ready to go, and by the time I got back to the hangar, it was fueled and ready to go. Had a flight plan on the system, took off, was 2.5 hours or so on out to El Paso, got the equipment up and running. I grabbed a little dinner, was home by Letterman, and just being able to do that and respond that way the clients obviously very much appreciate that. And I think it grows our bottom line because kind of there's that goodwill factor, there's the response, but we can do that without adding people. And so with 3 guys, we were able to cover a lot of ground. And I did the same thing when we started the teleradiology group. I had a Bonanza based right out here from Oklahoma, and I was able to cover an awful lot of ground. So from a development standpoint, I could call on a lot of prospects and see existing accounts. We had accounts scattered out across the Southwest into Mexico and Oklahoma, and in South and North Dakota, as well as the Mid-Atlantic. So from here in Oklahoma, I could very easily make a 1 or 2 day trip in the Dakotas and accomplish a lot of work.
Did you have a radius that you were working within that you tried to, say, hey, beyond this radius, it's probably cheaper or maybe even more efficient to go commercially? Or was it strictly on a customer by customer or, case by case basis?
Kind of a case by case basis. I know when I had the Bonanza and was using that and had the opportunity, and it was not so much responding to a crisis as it was just calling on clients and engaging in richer dialogue face to face than I ever could remotely, as well as prospecting. I sort of treated, it was kind of a break even really, if I operated within a 700 or so nautical mile radius. And it was pretty easy to run those numbers considering some of the places I was going. I already mentioned South Dakota. Where you could burn up a lot of time trying to get there, with connecting flights and that sort of thing. Generally speaking, if I'm flying myself to go out into my territory, I could always shave off and add another day in a hotel, another day of a rental car, and I could drop straight into the locale that I was trying to go, as opposed to having to land, especially if you consider the southwestern part of the country. If you look at scheduled airline service, it's quite common to land somewhere and then have another 3 or 4 hour drive ahead of you just to get to go see the client. And, that was never the case with an airplane. But in addition to that, even going to the Mid-Atlantic and the East Coast, if I did a pure cost benefit using the Bonanza versus an airline ticket, as soon as I added a second stop, the Bonanza won every time. And that's just because, I could add a number of stops along the way. And we had one of our physicians was stationed in Pensacola for a while. And I remember flying out to Leesburg in the National Capital area and then dropping down to Pensacola to spend some time with him, doing some planning for the business. And, the airline ticket, the 3-way with 3 legs in it, was terribly expensive. The Bonanza was 60% maybe of the cost.
Really?
Really? It was significant.
Yeah. And that's honestly, that's fairly rare because it generally is cheaper to fly commercially, but it doesn't always make sense at the end of the day because of what you're saying, because of the connections, the sit around time, the drive time, and all those things. And so I get a big kick out of the customers that we work with and the uses that they have for these airplanes, because so many of our customers come from places where, airline service, it's a ways off. They've got to drive. They got to get in their car and drive an hour or 2 or 3 just to get to a decent sized airport where they can, start their trip, not to mention have to make their connection. And so it's, these are kind of the movers and shakers of our economy, because they're the ones that are out there making things happen. They don't come from the big cities. They're not traveling to the big cities. They may go through them commercially, but not necessarily doing any business there. So.
Well, and that's a good point. My responsibilities, and that's a great case study for it, is when we had the teleradiology group. I mean, my responsibilities were financial. My responsibilities were operations. My responsibilities included development. And, travel time is not revenue generating productive time. So right. Just being able to move around a lot quicker and not burn so much time in between endpoints, I think that made it work. We would have had to hire at least 2 or 3 more people, in my view, if I hadn't had the airplane to use to just move around quicker.
Yeah. Well, and we are blessed being here in the central U.S. where it's relatively easy for us to go just about anywhere in the country in a pretty short amount of time. We don't necessarily, even commercially, we don't have to necessarily make a connection. But if you're in a location where you're 2 hours from the nearest major airport and you can get in your airplane, and even if you're doing, maybe it's only 170 knots true, maybe not even that fast, and you can sit in that airplane for 4 hours, and you can cover some serious territory.
Absolutely.
And that's great. So moving back to what you're doing with the Pilatus, how far do you see, what kind of range are you guys using this thing?
Well, again, it's a great airplane for what we do. And, I monitor on a monthly basis sort of what the moving average, what the typical trip looks like. And by far, the majority of what we do is within a couple of hours out. But, being based right here in the center part of the country in north central Oklahoma, that we can easily hit either coast nonstop. And so, a common trip on the coast might include, a trip to DC or a trip to pick a location in North Carolina. We go to the West Coast fairly often. We'll make a trip to Phoenix. We'll make a trip to San Diego, the LA area. That's easily done nonstop. More commonly, we have trips to Denver, Kansas City, multiple locations in Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Southeast. Very, very easy day trips. A couple hours out, couple hours back with plenty of time and to take care of the business that we're there to do and get back the same day and arrive not only at the destination but back home without the feeling of any kind of fatigue. Yeah.
And elaborate a little bit, if you would. What generation of Pilatus are we talking about here?
The Pilatus that I fly is it's a NG, so it's a serial number 1610 for anybody that's paying attention to those numbers. But it's a PC-12 slant 47, so it's got the Honeywell Apex system, PFDs, MFDs.
Yeah. So transition a little bit then into the background that you've got, which I think is very unique in that you have a lot of formal aviation training. You've gone in different directions, but aviation has always been kind of at the core of what you've been involved in some way. How do you translate that, or what benefit is there with that experience to the folks that we deal with, the buyers or the sellers of an airplane?
Well, I think I can understand somewhat, maybe more than just empathize, with who I perceive our client base to be, and that is owner flown business owner with a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of commitments, a lot of things going on. I certainly can appreciate that time is valuable, time is money, and I remember when I was contemplating buying the Bonanza, how my burning desire, I was just away from home when we were starting that business, and I did not have the Bonanza to fly. I was spending many, many nights away from home. And I think that was the one thing that was really driving me, was the desire to spend more nights in my home with my family. And my kids were pretty young back then. The airplane is it's the tool that allows you to really compress, to shrink the range, to shrink the world, and be able to get home more nights than you might otherwise be able to, and get back to your office where you can really get some things done if you need to.
Yeah. I think about one of our customers who has a municipal engineering firm, and he's told me multiple times that one of the ways he's able to retain his employees, not only are they in a somewhat remote location to begin with, but it's because those employees all have families. Right. They all have people that they want to get back to. For those of us who have spent more nights than we care to count in a hotel, one hotel after a while becomes just like the next. And the last thing you want to do is spend another night not in your own bed. And they keep their employees very happy, doing that. So,
right.
So if you were to put put a label on it or a pin on it, what kinds of companies do you think are the best suited, or maybe not? There's companies out there that shouldn't have an airplane, right? So what's your perspective on, where does the type of general aviation flying that you've been used to fall in? Where would that be best suited for an up and coming company?
That's a good question. I think it takes a well, what's the word? It's just coming to terms with the fact that airplanes are not for everyone, and you got to have an appreciation for the environment in which we're operating. As we're speaking, I'm thinking about even those times I've been tempted. They got to get there itis, they got to get home itis, kind of thing. You just have to establish. You have to be of the mindset, and you have to respect the parameters within which we operate, and you just have to commit at the outset to not operate that way, and put plenty of safeguards in place and respect the rules and the protocols that you develop, even personally, so that you don't find yourself in a pickle in a situation of high risk that you're not comfortable to be in. Weather being the primary mover, I guess, the primary factor as we think about that. So we are in a place in the country that's blessed with good weather and good airspace and accommodating airspace. But we're in the time of the year now when there's a lot of convective weather that's moving around. So,
right.
When I started flying sort of the way I'm doing now, would have been close to 20 years ago, we did not have weather in the cockpit like we do now. It's so much better now.
Yeah,
to be able to have, it's really, really, it's great. But, it used to be, you'd take a look at the radar, maybe get a briefing, before you leave. But then once you're in the airplane, you're operating on what you looked at, 20 or 30 minutes ago. And
right. That's
still valuable because you can still look at that and understand what the trends are, what the patterns are, where the movement is headed. Because even with some of the NEXRAD weather imagery, that kind of imagery that we can have in the cockpit now, there's still some delay unless you have live radar on the airplane. To answer the question, I think the people that really appreciate general aviation and the functionality and the leverage that it brings are those that are probably fiercely independent and really, really, really care, take a very personal stake in the product that they're putting out, and the customer and the customer base and the people that they serve. Those are all noble things, and it's nice to think that all companies would do that. But I'm talking about the ones that just really take a personal stake in that and want to maintain some kind of physical touch as frequently as they can.
Sure.
I think for the company that we were, the teleradiology group, it was the bonanza. It's just a bonanza, but it was a great tool for me. And, we recognized pretty rapid development. So we were in that development mode. We were growing the business, and, just having that capability accelerated our development. There's no doubt about it, because again, I was able to cover a lot of ground that would typically require multiple people to do.
Yeah. You touched on a really interesting point, and that is you've got pretty independent people, people that are, these are folks, generally a lot of the folks that we work with, and I think it probably includes all of us as well. We want to get out there and we want to make things happen, and we don't like typically sitting on our hands. And that's all fine and dandy until it comes sometimes to the operation of aircraft. And you have to recognize that tendency in your own personality and tame that somehow, whether it's handing the reins off to somebody else to do the flying, or to having a strict and rigid set of operating rules that you abide by regardless of how desperately you want to get home that night or get to see that customer that day.
Right.
And that's really a good point. You actually gave me an idea. I don't know about you. You probably do, but I've got actually for my general aviation flying, I've got a written list of maybe, I don't know, it's 10 or 12 things that are my personal minimums. So when I'm flying my airplane, for example, it's single engine airplane. I don't mind flying IFR, but my personal min is that if I don't have basic VFR mins on departure or the forecast for arrival, I won't go. So 1,003. Now that doesn't mean the weather might go down. Okay. But I'm not going to put myself in a situation in a single engine airplane where I'm forcing myself to shoot a precision approach on the other end. Another thing is I won't fly any more than a total of 9 hours a day. And I won't fly after 11 o'clock at night because I know my body well enough
right.
that, at 9:30, I'm ready to go to bed, much less 11. So you give me an idea there. And I think those are some things that we should be sharing more with our customers when we sell, particularly, and just say, hey, do these with, whatever you want. But these are just some lessons that we've learned.
Well, and I think so. As I think about it and as we talk about it, I think another thing to consider is, I learned early on, and it was likely in an accident investigation class that I was in. I learned that, those accidents that we read about and hear about that make the media, by far the majority of those occurred after a series of events took
right.
place that were responded to in one way or another. It's rarely one issue. It's rarely one link in the chain that causes something to hit the headlines. So, to answer that, another answer to that question, who's the right candidate to consider a general aviation airplane or even, an airplane that they use in business? Well, it's got to be a customer that does not underestimate and can afford the time and the resources to take care of the airplane and to take care of the proficiency of whoever's flying it, whether it's the owner or whether it's a hard pilot. And that's a different answer, for whoever for everybody. It depends on the airplane, depends on the pilot, depends on the frequency of the flight. But we run into airplanes, in the business we're in, we run into, we encounter airplanes that people have had, that they had great intentions in when they purchased it and something changed and, the little things crop up and maintenance items become deferred, and that's just something
right.
that you can do. I mean, as soon as that starts to happen, as soon as that becomes a pattern, well, that's at least something to recognize, and it requires mitigation, at least at minimum.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, given those minimums and those situations we've gotten ourselves into, I'll put you on the spot here. Do you have some personal story or anecdote of a situation, flying, maybe it was for business, that you look back on it and say, man, I should have never allowed myself to get there?
There's probably a few of those, but there's one that's head and shoulders above, and it's a great one. I was flying that twin Cessna. It was that R model, turbocharged 310, and I had two other guys on the airplane with me. All three of us were pilots. Two of us flew it, but all three were pilots, and we were on a routine trip. We went to a place down in Northeast Texas that we spent a lot of time in. We were there generally during that area. We would spend at least a day or two a week in that town and taking care of that customer in Northeast Texas. So we knew the route very, very well. It was actually on my mind as I was discussing how nice it is to have the weather in the cockpit that we have now, because at that time we did not. So, what we looked at before we left was the weather, the radar depiction, on the monitor in the flight planning room at the FBO before we left. And we saw that it looked pretty nasty, but we had a good airplane that could get high if we needed to. But it was a line of thunderstorms that were developing along a frontal boundary. And I'm traveling from northeastern Texas back to Oklahoma City. The right side, the northeast side of this line extended well up and around Chicago. So way, way, way up there. And the left end was, I don't recall, somewhere down around Abilene maybe. So, it dipped way on down into Texas. It would have been a long trip to go around the end of it. And, thunderstorm tops, they can really develop and blow up
Yeah.
really, really high, a lot higher than the service ceiling of that, even though it was a turbocharged airplane, a lot higher than that airplane could go. So we all elected together. It was at the end of the day. So we had spent the day there working, and we were flying home. It was at the end of the day. And I think it probably helped that they were pilots, but maybe not. But we elected that we would go take a look. There was still some daylight, and we approached. We sort of took this thing head on. We were going to look for a gap that we could shoot. There were still some on the radar. When we looked at it, and we got up to it where we could see it, and those gaps had all closed up. The vertical development had increased, and it was getting really, really tall. But we could see sunlight on the ground below it. So we all looked at it and thought, well, it's not too far across there. I bet we can make it. So we jumped down. I was flying. I was in the left seat. We jumped down and went underneath it. And, man, that was the worst ride in an airplane I've ever experienced. And by the time we got to the other side, when we could look back with the light from the west shining on what we just flew under, we all vowed that we would never do that again. We saw some colors that you don't really like to see and you don't often see in weather. Some kind of dark cobalt purple kind of colors that were pretty nasty. Impressive, magnificent, but not from the window of an airplane.
Yeah. Yeah, we've all been in situations like that, especially as you get to be, our young and youthful age, and get to that breadth of experience, and sometimes it's not just one or two of those situations. It's multiple of them as different scenarios present themselves, and like you said earlier, so many of those are because of a chain of events. And it's recognizing and mitigating those things early on.
And I think the lessons learned played out just maybe a year or so ago when I had a trip in the Pilatus to take a group of guys to Colorado, and we had exactly the same kind of setup, a frontal boundary moving down our way, and big nasty thunderstorms, even in the early part of the day that we're building along those lines and along that line. We could have, and the airplane's faster, we could have gone around one end of it, but I just advised them that there was no way that the ride was going to be a good ride. And we still had to plan, a return trip later that same day. And it was, the forecast called for more of the same throughout the day. And I advised that we really just ought to look for a different day. And in the end, it really worked out well because we found another day when the weather was great, had a great trip. And we were actually able to take another airplane and take more people on that second day. So it was a much more productive trip by waiting.
Right. Well, that's a great story, and thank you. And, I'm sitting here looking at the clock and realize how quickly our conversation has gone, and I wanted to kind of honor our time commitment on this. But thanks for taking the time to share all that. And I think for anybody that's watching this, there's lots to learn. Mac's got a lot of wisdom. He's got a lot of experience, a lot of stories to tell. And, that all comes not only with age, but with dedication to your profession. And one of the differences that I hope that you see with Mac here in terms of buying or selling airplanes is that we're not just in it for the buying and the selling. We love, and we are enthralled with the entire aspect of aviation. We love learning. And so, that's what this podcast is about not just buying and selling, but it's about the lifestyles and the lives and businesses and how you can use those airplanes, and just as a couple of examples. So anyway, Mac, thanks so much. I really appreciate spending this time with me.
Enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the WildBlue podcast. Find us online at flywildblue.com. And don't forget to subscribe and share.